start now, so if we could have quiet. Thank you. Ready? We have C-SPAN with us today, so obviously we'll be on the record. And I am Justine Rosenthal, the editor of The National Interest. I thank you all for coming today. And we have with us Richard Perle, who has one of the cover stories in the January-February edition of The National Interest with us.
Sorry.
Are we going to start this again then?
Can you put this in your...
In my phone?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Larry.
Okay, we're going to rewind. So you'll hear my spiel again. I'm Justine Rosenthal, the editor of The National Interest. I thank you all for being here today. We have with us Richard Perle, who has one of the cover stories from the January-February issue of The National Interest. And we're very grateful for him for coming here. And he is going to speak with us, I think, about the neocon conspiracy, or lack thereof, in foreign policy. Also, the way forward for the neocon agenda in the Obama administration, and why it is that we may not see many differences in foreign policy between this administration and its predecessor. Thank you for being with us, Richard.
No, it's a pleasure, Justine.
And Richard Perle, I think, really needs no introduction, but just to give a couple of highlights, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration, also, of course, chairman of the Defense Policy Board in the most recent Bush administration, and now is a resident fellow at AEI. And I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. I see there are a number of people out here who believe and have expressed themselves abundantly that there is a neoconservative foreign policy, that it was the policy that dominated the Bush administration, and that the people who subscribe to it bear responsibility for the deplorable state of the world. None of that is true, of course, and the theme of the National Interest piece, which Justine says is the cover piece, she's got 9 cover pieces.
Only 5.
And 10 pieces in the book, but it's a very effective public relations gambit. None of that is true. I'm going to read just a couple of statements that are typical. And as it happens, they're not by anyone in the room, but they could be from several people in the room because they've said similar things. This is a book called The Theocons by Damon Linker. And he says, neocons and theocons both advocate a foreign policy geared toward the promotion of democracy around the world using military force. There's no documentation, and indeed it is astonishing how little documentation there is in support of the main commentary with respect to neoconservatives, neoconservative foreign policy, and neoconservative influence on the Bush administration. This is a book by Eric Alterman and Mark Green, in which he refers to like-minded neoconservatives, and then he provides a list. Donald Rumsfeld, who I think would be surprised to know that he was regarded as neoconservative. Stephen Cambone, no reason to think he is neoconservative or would think of himself in that way. Dov Zakheim, Zal Khalilzad, Vice President Cheney, and a great many others. In fact, the lists of neoconservatives are almost always a cobbled-together list of people with whom the commentator has a grievance. And usually it's the same grievance. It is a left critique of what is believed by the commentator to be a right-wing policy. I went out of my way in this piece to try to show that the philosophical source of Bush administration policy was not philosophical at all. If you asked George Bush whether he had responded to the world, particularly after 9/11, in a pragmatic way, seeking to make the country safer in ways that seemed to him appropriate, I think he would say yes, of course. If you asked him what underlying philosophy motivated those policies, you would probably get a long pause before he attempted an answer. This is not to be disparaging of Bush, who I think was a decent man, but I don't believe was motivated by any particular philosophy. In his life, he certainly was, religious conviction and so forth, but in the choice of policies, whether and how to respond to 9/11, for example, which was the dominant set of policy decisions that he had to make, there were, as far as I can tell, no philosophical underpinnings, and certainly nothing like the demonic influence of neoconservatives that is alleged in books like these, and Halper's book, and several others. Forgive me if I'm not recalling them all. I'm going to stop there, except to add one point about a change in continuity from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. The tone is certainly different. We've already seen that. Obama is a far more effective communicator than Bush. In fact, Bush's inability to explain himself contributed significantly to his problems, in my view. He never adequately explained what he was doing or why he was doing it. He had a press operation in the White House that was not much better than he was, and sometimes worse. So people were left to speculate, and he was largely defined by his critics, not by the things that he was able to say himself. So one small exception here are the set-piece speeches, which on the whole were pretty good and articulate. But you don't find much of the critique of Bush based on what Bush said in his speeches, as you don't find the critique of neoconservatives based on what neoconservatives have said or written. I say in the piece in the National Interest that I can't find a single example of a neoconservative supposed to have influence over the Bush administration arguing that we should impose democracy by force in Iraq or anywhere else. Now, there's probably someone out there who will find some foolish remark made by someone who could be described as a neoconservative, but to suggest that this is an abiding belief or outlook of neoconservatives is just nonsense. It isn't so, and the frequency with which it's repeated doesn't make it so. Obama's tone is different, but the substance is not substantially different. The venue that he may seek for a dialogue with the Iranians may be a different venue, or with the North Koreans, but the substance will be, in my view, largely the same, if not immediately, eventually, because he will not, no matter what medium of expression he chooses, convince the Iranians to give up their nuclear ambitions or other key elements of their policy. He will fail similarly with the North Koreans, and whatever he hopes to achieve by bilateral as opposed to multi-party talks, or by meeting directly as opposed to indirectly, in the end, I think he will wind up with policies rather like his predecessor. And one of the reasons for that is that for at least the second Bush term, and I think well into the first Bush term, American policy was dominated by the default positions of the Department of State, the diplomatic establishment. And that diplomatic establishment has not changed. And Hillary may bring some fresh approaches to it, but if I had to guess, I would guess that the traditional outlook of our diplomatic service will prevail in this administration as it prevailed largely in the Bush administration. Now I really will stop.
All right, well, I will start with the opening question, and then we'll do Q&A, and if you could all please identify yourselves and your affiliation Now, Richard, as you even say in your piece, as one of the people who's been labeled as an architect of the Iraq War, how do you feel now about the potential drawdown of troops? Is there something you would like to see done differently? Do you think we're going to see stability now in the country? You obviously were supportive of the surge.
The important thing about the surge, which I did support, was not the additional troops, in my view. It was the radical change in strategy and the new leadership that was brought to bear, General Petraeus in particular. I'm optimistic about Iraq. It's always hazardous to be optimistic about Iraq, but things are vastly better today than they were. It's fragile, and the success that has been achieved could be reversed. It could be undermined. I have enough respect for President Obama's intelligence and political acumen to think that he will not jeopardize the success by a hasty and premature withdrawal. Why would he do that? The pressure to withdraw has subsided significantly. Maybe not as far as it should have subsided, but in fact our losses are way down from what they were, happily. Why jeopardize what appears to be a success? And how would one explain that action if, in fact, things turn bad again afterward? That's a political risk that I don't think this president will take. I may be wrong. So I expect that there will be a gradual drawdown as circumstances allow. Now, my impression is that there's an options paper making its way through the administration that looks at 3 levels. That's probably the worst possible way to decide the policy. An arbitrary number attached to an arbitrary number of months. But that's what one expects from the bureaucracy. I think at the end of the day, Bush will not want to tinker with success. I'm sorry, Obama. Obama will not want to tinker with success.
Larry.
Richard, let me ask you,
Could you introduce yourself?
Larry Korb from the Center for American Progress, about the national security strategy. You could read that and say that it does talk about democracy as an agenda, force, preventive war. I mean, one could make in that. Now, by the way, I think I've read them all. This is probably the 2002 and 2006, very specific and, does outline a lot of those points. I mean, would you say that that does not reflect sort of the neoconservative philosophy at all?
I don't know whether President Bush ever read any of those statements. My guess is he didn't, Larry, and the people who've been producing those statements are the same people I've known in Washington for 30 years. Nothing distinctively neoconservative about statements of the kind you allude to, some of which are sort of idle in any case. Of course, we believe in democracy, and you will not find a government document of any consequence that doesn't make references to our democratic underpinnings. Preventive war, or preemption as it was called, has always struck me as, of course the details matter, but has always struck me as a kind of basic common sense proposition. If you know you're about to be struck and you can avoid that by striking first, who wouldn't strike first? Now, you may get it wrong. You may also get it wrong by waiting too long and suffering that strike. As for military power as a way of producing democracy, I don't know of official statements to that effect, and I don't know of statements by neoconservatives to that effect. And I made that point in the article hoping somebody would challenge it and find the statement that proves me wrong, and it hasn't happened yet.
In the back here in the blue shirt.
Edward Luce from the Financial Times. You might already partly answered that question, but it was just a simple request for your boilerplate definition of what a neoconservative believes.
Well, in fact, I think that there is no such thing as a neoconservative foreign policy. I think neoconservatism was essentially a